All right, let's finish up Dickinson and poetry, because I want to move on to short stories, like, really badly. To really pick apart Dickinson's poetry is to kind of, like, take a kind of insane trip through the breakdown of somebody's mental process, at least in the way that I interpret it. Keep in mind, as I go through all this stuff, I'm not exactly saying that this is exactly what she thought or exactly what she intended. Rather, it's really more of like the way that I react to it. So we talked a little bit about Wild Nights and some of the happier poetry and some of the kind of mixing of the hymnal sounds, the style that she wrote in, the fact that it's not as tightly constrained to different like rhyme schemes and stuff. As these poems continue on, I think that you can sort of mark where the mental process started to fall apart and see where it started to affect her terms and affect her vocabulary and affect her structure even. Let's start with the one that I think is the signal. This one is I Never Lost As Much But Twice. Some people call it I Never Lost. Again, she didn't really, title her poems. They were just like a whole bunch, scribbled on a whole bunch of notes. So connecting these together in any type of chronology is nigh on near impossible. But follow along with me as I read this one. I never lost as much but twice, and that was in the sod. Twice have I stood a beggar before the door of God. Angels twice descending reimbursed my store. Burglar, banker, father, I am poor once more. This poem is fascinating for a number of reasons. I think that, if I remember correctly, there were several points in Dickinson's life where she was very severely traumatized or affected emotionally. I believe the death of her father was one. Dissolution of a relationship was another. And so what we have here is, I think, potentially a dating for this poem as later in her life as opposed to earlier, as she's talking about these painful experiences. She chooses not to explore them in depth, kind of keeping them, amorphous and vague. The part of this that strikes me the most, there's two things. I never lost as much but twice, and that was in the sod. Sod is like the ready-made grass that you use to, like, get a lawn growing. It's a really strange image. How could she lose in the sod? It could be referring to a grave, sodded over. The sod is the grass growing up around it. I'm not 100% certain. It's the mystery of it that makes it kind of intriguing. But the other part of this is, you see Dickinson's kind of religious reverence. She was a very, very religious person. But she's, making this claim to the angels. She's talking to the angels who supposedly have lifted her out of despair before. And she's calling out to God again. But look at the way that she refers to him at the end. When she says, angels twice descending reimbursed my store. So it was like reimbursed what she lost or reimbursed her sense of life herself. But as she calls out to God, she says, burglar, banker, father. Burglar and banker kind of brings to mind the biblical verses where we refer to God and when we say the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. And, the idea of the omniscience of God, meaning that God kind of, has knowledge and control of the loss in your life as opposed to the reward. So when Dickinson is, calling out to God here, she's referring to him as the being who is, capable of her reimbursement, capable of making her feel whole again, but he's also vaguely responsible for the pain that has befallen her. It's a really, really, in my opinion, mature and very divided and painful recognition. Now, this, in my opinion, starts a process of gradual degradation, and you start to see that Dickinson's images, in my opinion, corrode and kind of rot away in a very frightening and just kind of distressing way. Now, the next title has my favorite. The next poem has my favorite, title, even though it's just taken from the first line. That's, I felt a funeral in my brain. Isn't that great? I felt a funeral in my brain. I mean, that is something. So, let's just read this one out loud real quick. Let's just read this one real quick. Now give a little analysis, and I'll follow this up with one more video. I could talk about Dickinson all day. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service, like a drum, kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, and all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and I in silence, some strange race wrecked solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world every plunge, and finished knowing then. As someone who's struggled with depression in the past, this poem does a fantastic job of painting a picture for us of a mental collapse. And the way that the poem begins, I felt a funeral in my brain. How on earth do you feel a funeral? Nonetheless, in your brain. How do you feel a funeral? We feel, despair. We feel loss. But feeling it in your brain, that's a really big disjoint. And this is something that comes up in her poetry quite a bit. And when she does this, she's making usually very poignant and very pertinent points. So we feel a funeral. We've got mourners treading around in our head until it seems that sense is breaking through. I mean, when you say you're losing your senses, in this case, her senses are breaking as these mourners in her head are walking around. Wow, that is pretty crazy sounding, right? But at the same time, it makes a lot of sense. As if anybody has ever struggled with mental illness before, you get a sense that you're losing control of yourself, that things are happening and you don't understand the nature of what's happening to you. And, so describing it in ways that are very disjointed and disconnected, almost, unidentifiable, makes a lot of sense. Moving on. When they all were seated, a service, like a drum, kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. It reminds me of The Telltale Heart from Edgar Allan Poe, when he hears the heartbeat under the floor, but you can also guess that he's feeling his own heartbeat rushing, and hearing his own heartbeat. This service like a drum is beating in my head. Again, it is really indicative of Crazy Town. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead, hearing their footsteps as these mourners in your head are just stomping around. Then space began to toll. It's erupted outside of our brain now, and it's everywhere. It's just ringing out in space as all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, she's reducing herself to nothing but the organ and the part that is hearing. All she is nothing but the ear that hears this noise. It has consumed her. Being but an ear, and I, and silence, and some strange race wrecked, solitary here. The sense of abandonment and just aloneness. And the words, again, not matching up with anything that we can really connect with. Cray-cray. But it's also beautiful, and it evokes a lot of emotion from me because I get what she's talking about. The last stanza is fantastic. And then a plank in reason broke. And I dropped down, and I hit a world at every plunge and finished knowing then. In this case, we've exploded out into a weird state of cosmology. As this plank in reason breaks, as it snaps, she falls, hitting a world at and hitting a world at every plunge. The feeling of falling and descending and just completely breaking through all that you know. And she finishes knowing then. Is finishes knowing, is that final? Or is she cut off something that was supposed to come after it? She finished knowing, then what? There is a dash on the end of then, which suggests to me that the idea at the end of this poem is not complete. It's cut off and it's isolated. Again, when we get into I heard a fly buzz when I died, this is actually going to make a lot more sense of the idea of just cutting off existence at one bit, just, severing it. And leaving it unfinished in this, again, really speaks to the craziness and the interrupted nature of the thought that as we're just going down this tube into less and less and less coherence, it's getting just like more and more unsettling as we go. So, wow, what a poem. Again, we're going to continue with this. I want to finish up Dickinson and poetry this week. Let me gather my thoughts for the last two because, man, I love Dickinson.